The metabolic collapse, 10 silent killers engineered to keep you sick. We are witnessing a biological siege. It isn't merely a lack of willpower, it is a systematic dismantling of human metabolic health driven by modern convenience and engineered addiction. The statistics are catastrophic, but the biological mechanisms at play are even more sinister. Your body is currently fighting a losing war against an environment designed to make it fail, aggressively storing toxic energy for a famine that never arrives. To survive, you must ruthlessly excise these behaviors before the damage becomes irreversible, starting with the most deceptive culprit hiding in your hand.
The liquid toxin, the insidious biochemistry of sugary drinks, and the visceral fat epidemic. To understand the cataclysmic impact of daily sugary drink consumption, one must first dismantle the prevailing cultural notion that a calorie is simply a calorie. This reductionist view, propagated for decades by the food industry to absolve their products of blame, is nowhere more dangerously incorrect than in the context of liquid sugar. When you consume a sweetened beverage, whether it is a carbonated soda, a sweetened tea, an energy drink, or a commercially processed fruit juice, you are not merely ingesting energy, you are initiating a violent, rapid-fire biochemical assault on your liver that the human body has no evolutionary blueprint to handle. Solid food, even food rich in carbohydrates, enters the digestive system bound to fiber and protein, requiring mechanical breakdown in the stomach and a gradual enzymatic release in the small intestine. This process acts as a metabolic brake, allowing the pancreas to release insulin in a controlled, rhythmic manner. Liquid sugar removes the brake entirely. It is a floodgate opening. Within minutes of ingestion, a tsunami of glucose and fructose hits the portal vein, rushing directly to the liver with a velocity that overwhelms the organ's processing capacity. This is not nutrition, it is a metabolic emergency. The primary villain in this narrative is fructose. Unlike glucose, which can be utilized by almost every cell in the human body for energy, your muscles, your brain, your heart, fructose is a burden borne almost exclusively by the liver. In this way, the metabolism of fructose is biochemically nearly identical to the metabolism of ethanol, alcohol. When you drink a large soda, you are essentially inflicting the same hepatic stress as a heavy drinker, minus the neurological buzz. The liver, inundated with this sudden surplus of energy that it cannot use and cannot store as glycogen since glycogen stores are limited and likely full, has only one defensive maneuver left, de novo lipogenesis, DNL. This is the biological process of turning sugar directly into fat. This fat does not immediately migrate to the hips or thighs, it stays locally, infesting the liver cells themselves. This is the genesis of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD, a condition once rare and now endemic in children as young as 10 years old. As the liver becomes congested with fat, it becomes insulin resistant,
forcing the pancreas to pump out even more insulin in a desperate attempt to regulate blood sugar, creating a vicious cycle of hyperinsulinemia that locks the body in permanent fat storage mode. However, the devastation extends far beyond the liver. The fat produced by liquid sugar consumption is preferentially stored as visceral adipose tissue. This is not the subcutaneous fat you can pinch on your arm. This is deep intra-abdominal fat that wraps itself around your vital organs, the kidneys, the pancreas, the intestines, and the heart. Visceral fat is not metabolically inert storage, it is an active endocrine organ. It functions like a parasitic gland, secreting inflammatory cytokines such as interleukin-6, IL-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha, TNF-alpha. These chemicals trigger systemic, chronic inflammation, placing the body in a state of constant biological alarm. This inflammation damages blood vessels, contributes to arterial plaque, and disrupts hormonal signaling throughout the body. The person who consumes sugary drinks daily is essentially carrying a toxic waste dump in their abdomen that continuously leaches poison into their bloodstream, accelerating aging, damaging DNA, and radically increasing the risk of cardiovascular collapse. The insidiousness of liquid sugar lies in its ability to bypass the brain's satiety centers. This is the satiety gap. In the millions of years of hominid evolution, calories were always associated with chewing, swallowing, and gastric distension. We have evolved complex hormonal feedback loops involving ghrelin, leptin, and peptide YY to tell us when we are full. Liquid sugar hacks this system. It slips past the sensors. You can consume 800 calories of soda, the equivalent of a substantial meal, and your brain will not register that you have eaten. The hunger hormone ghrelin does not suppress. In fact, due to the ensuing insulin spike and subsequent blood sugar crash, hunger often increases. This leads to the phenomenon of overcompensation, where individuals consume these liquid calories on top of their normal caloric intake rather than instead of it. The body is flooded with energy, yet the brain screams that it is starving, creating a terrifying physiological disconnect that makes weight gain mathematically inevitable. We must also scrutinize the historical and industrial context that allowed this habit to become the default mode of hydration for millions. The pivot point occurred in the 1970s,
a period marked by fluctuating food prices and political instability. The introduction of high-fructose corn syrup, HFCS, as a cheaper, sweeter, and more stable alternative to cane sugar revolutionized the beverage industry. It allowed manufacturers to supersize portions while lowering costs. The standard 6.5-ounce soda bottle of the 1950s, a treat, morphed into the 12-ounce can, then the 20-ounce bottle, and finally the 64-ounce bucket sold at convenience stores. This was not accidental drift, it was engineered escalation. Food scientists discovered the bliss point, the precise concentration of sweetness that maximizes sensory pleasure without becoming cloying, ensuring the consumer keeps drinking. Simultaneously, marketing campaigns aggressively tied sugary drinks to concepts of happiness, vitality, and athleticism, effectively brainwashing generations into associating a metabolic toxin with the joy of life. The global ramifications of this habit are nothing short of a slow-motion genocide. As Western diets have been exported to developing nations, we see a synchronized explosion of obesity and metabolic syndrome. In countries like Mexico, where soda is often cheaper than clean water, the health system is buckling under the weight of diabetes-related amputations and blindness. The daily consumption of sugary drinks is the single strongest statistical predictor of future obesity. It is a habit that alters the palate, desensitizing the tongue to the subtle sweetness of natural foods like fruit, making healthy eating feel bland and unsatisfying. It rewires the reward pathways in the brain, creating a dopamine-driven dependency that rivals narcotics. Eliminating this habit is not merely a dietary adjustment, it is a medical intervention. Replacing liquid sugar with water, black coffee, or unsweetened tea is the single most effective action a human being can take to halt visceral fat accumulation. To continue drinking these beverages is to voluntarily participate in the destruction of one's own metabolic machinery, drinking a slow poison that rots the body from the inside out, hiding behind a veil of carbonation and caramel color.
2. The chronobiological disaster, frequent late-night eating and the destruction of circadian rhythm. While the composition of what we eat is critical, the timing of when we eat it is an equally powerful yet often ignored determinant of obesity. The habit of frequent late-night eating represents a fundamental violation of our biological programming, a discordance between our modern lifestyle and our ancient genetic code that scientists call chronodisruption. For practically the entirety of human existence, our species operated on a strict cycle of light and dark. We were diurnal hunters and gatherers. We foraged and feasted when the sun was high, and we fasted and slept when the sun went down. This rhythm is not merely a behavioral preference, it's hardwired into the molecular clockwork of every cell in the human body. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN, in the hypothalamus serves as the master clock, synchronized by light entering the retina. However, we now know that peripheral clocks exist in the liver, the pancreas, the gut, and adipose tissue. These peripheral clocks are synchronized not by light, but by food intake. When you eat late at night, you are effectively decoupling your master clock from your metabolic clocks, creating a state of internal jet lag that devastates your ability to process energy. When the sun sets and darkness approaches, the pineal gland begins to secrete melatonin, the hormone that signals the onset of sleep. Melatonin does more than just make you drowsy. It communicates to the pancreas to shut down production. It signals the beta cells to rest. Consequently, insulin sensitivity drops precipitously in the evening. The body shifts from an anabolic state, building and storing, to a catabolic and reparative state, cleaning and fasting. When you consume a meal at 11 p.m., whether it is a full dinner, a snack, or even a bowl of healthy fruit, you are forcing food into a system that has technically closed for business. Because insulin sensitivity is naturally low at night, the glucose from that late meal stays in the bloodstream significantly longer, causing extended hyperglycemia. The pancreas, which should be resting, is jarred awake and forced to pump out massive amounts of insulin to manage this sugar spike. This nocturnal insulin surge is catastrophic because insulin is the primary signal for fat storage. By spiking insulin during the hours of sleep,
you are instructing your body to hoard fat exactly when it should be mobilizing it for repair. Furthermore, late-night eating obliterates the vital process of autophagy. Autophagy is the body's cellular housekeeping mechanism, a cleaning process where cells degrade and recycle their own damaged components, including misfolded proteins and dysfunctional mitochondria. This process is heavily dependent on the fasting state. It typically engages only after several hours of not eating. By snacking late into the night and eating again early in the morning, modern humans have shortened their fasting window to the point where deep autophagy rarely occurs. The result is an accumulation of cellular junk that impairs metabolic efficiency and accelerates aging. The mitochondria, the power plants of the cells, become sluggish and inefficient, burning fewer calories and generating more oxidative stress. This metabolic rigidity means that the calories consumed at night are not burned off as heat or kinetic energy. They are almost exclusively sequestered into adipose tissue, contributing to the expansion of the waistline even if the total calorie count for the day is technically within limits. The psychological and hormonal drivers of late-night eating create a self-perpetuating trap. We are battling the night eating syndrome phenomenon, often driven by dysregulated cortisol.
In a healthy individual, cortisol, the stress hormone, should peak in the morning to wake us up and taper off in the evening. However, the chronic stress of modern life, work emails, financial anxiety, the blue light from screens, keeps cortisol levels elevated into the night. High cortisol triggers cravings for high carbohydrate, high fat comfort foods because these foods temporarily dampen the stress response. Simultaneously, sleep deprivation or poor sleep quality disrupts the balance of hunger hormones. It suppresses leptin, the satiety hormone, and elevates ghrelin, the hunger hormone. The tired brain, desperate for a quick energy hit to keep functioning, screams for sugar. This is why late-night snacks are rarely salads. They are almost invariably calorie-dense, hyper-palatable processed foods. This creates a feedback loop. Eating late disrupts sleep quality as the body struggles to digest while it should be resting, and poor sleep quality increases the drive to eat late the next day. Culturally, we have normalized this pathological behavior through the architecture of the modern economy and media. The concept of the fourth meal, marketed aggressively by fast food chains, frames late-night gluttony as a fun, rebellious lifestyle choice. The proliferation of on-demand food delivery apps has removed the friction of preparing food, making it possible to have a 2,000-calorie feast delivered to your doorstep at midnight with the tap of a finger. We live in an era of eternal illumination, where electric light allows us to override the natural signals of dusk. We watch television and scroll through social media feeds that are saturated with food advertising, triggering Pavlovian hunger responses at hours when our ancestors would have been in deep slumber. We have created a society that eats around the clock, ignoring the fact that our biology is strictly time-restricted. The physiological consequences of this habit extend into the gastrointestinal realm, further complicating obesity. Lying down shortly after eating compromises the lower esophageal sphincter, leading to gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD. But beyond discomfort, the presence of nutrients in the gut during sleep alters the microbiome. Recent research suggests that gut bacteria also have circadian rhythms. Feeding them at the wrong time promotes the growth of dysbiotic bacterial strains that are more efficient at extracting calories from food and triggering systemic inflammation. This means that the late-night eater is essentially farming a gut microbiome that is optimized for obesity. To eliminate the habit of late-night eating is to respect the fundamental duality of human existence, activity and rest, feeding and fasting. It requires a rigid re-implementation of boundaries that technology has erased. The kitchen closed policy is not a diet tip, it is a metabolic necessity. By finishing the last meal at least 3 to 4 hours before sleep, we align our nutrient intake with our maximum insulin sensitivity. We allow the wave of digestion to subside before the wave of melatonin rises. We permit the body to enter the deep, restorative states of sleep, where fat oxidation is maximized and growth hormone is released. The elimination of late-night eating restores metabolic flexibility, allowing the body to switch effortlessly between burning sugar for fuel during the day and burning fat for fuel during the night. Continuing to eat into the darkness is a signal of metabolic confusion,
a refusal to let the body repair itself, and a direct invitation for obesity to take permanent residence in the tissues. We must reclaim the night for sleep, not for consumption.
3. The beige plague, excess refined carbohydrate intake and the insulin roller coaster. To comprehend the obesity epidemic, one must look closely at the fundamental alteration of the human food supply that occurred during the Industrial Revolution, specifically regarding the processing of grains. The third habit, excess refined carbohydrate intake, is not merely about overeating. It is about the consumption of a substance that has been technologically stripped of its biological safeguards. For thousands of years, humans consumed grains in their whole, unadulterated state. A kernel of wheat, rice, or corn is a complex structure consisting of 3 parts: the bran, the fiber-rich outer shell, the germ, the nutrient-dense embryo containing fats and vitamins, and the endosperm, the starchy energy cache. Nature designed these components to be consumed together. The fiber in the bran acts as a physical barrier and a biochemical brake, slowing the enzymatic breakdown of the starch into glucose. The fats and protein in the germ provide satiety and essential nutrients. However, in the late 19th century, with the advent of high-speed steel roller milling, humanity made a fatal error in the name of shelf stability and texture. We invented a way to efficiently strip away the bran and the germ, leaving only the endosperm, pure, naked starch. This was the birth of refined carbohydrates, white flour, white rice, and eventually the ultra-processed noodles that line supermarket shelves today. When you consume these refined carbohydrates, whether in the form of a fluffy white bagel, a bowl of jasmine rice, or a brick of instant noodles, you are essentially injecting glucose directly into your bloodstream. Without the fiber matrix to slow digestion, the enzymes in your saliva and stomach break down these simple starch chains into sugar with terrifying speed.
This results in a postprandial glucose spike that rivals the consumption of pure table sugar. The body, detecting this sudden toxic surge of blood glucose, panics. The pancreas responds by flooding the system with a massive wave of insulin to shuttle the sugar out of the blood and into the cells. This is the insulin spike. Because the glucose hit was so rapid, the insulin response is often exaggerated, driving blood sugar down too low too fast. This leads to reactive hypoglycemia, the crash. In this state of low blood sugar, the brain's primitive survival centers scream for immediate energy, triggering intense,
uncontrollable cravings for more refined carbohydrates. This creates a physiological loop of spike, crash, crave that can continue all day, keeping insulin levels chronically elevated. The chronic elevation of insulin is the master switch for obesity. Insulin is an anabolic hormone. Its job is to store energy. When insulin is high, fat burning, lipolysis, is biochemically impossible. The body is locked in storage mode. Furthermore, the constant bombardment of insulin causes the cells to eventually stop listening to the signal, a condition known as insulin resistance. The receptors on the surface of the muscle and liver cells become desensitized. To compensate, the pancreas pumps out even more insulin to force the glucose in. This state of hyperinsulinemia means that even when you are not eating, your background insulin levels remain high enough to block fat burning. The excess glucose that cannot enter the muscle cells is diverted to the liver, where it is converted into triglycerides and stored as visceral fat. Thus, a diet high in refined carbohydrates fundamentally alters the hormonal landscape of the body to prioritize fat accumulation, regardless of the total caloric intake. We must also scrutinize the specific offenders that have become staples of the modern diet. White bread, once a symbol of status and purity, has become a metabolic weapon. The modern Chorley wood bread process, developed in the 1960s to produce bread rapidly using high-energy mixing and chemical oxidizers, results in a product with a soft, open texture that requires almost no chewing. This lack of mechanical resistance means we eat more faster. The starch gelatinization is so complete that the glycemic index of modern white bread is often higher than that of sucrose. Then there is white rice. While billions of people in Asia have thrived on rice for centuries, the context has changed. Historically, rice consumption was coupled with high levels of physical labor and caloric scarcity. Today, in a sedentary caloric surplus environment, large portions of white rice act as a pure sugar load. The sheer volume of rice served in modern dining, often 3 or 4 cups per sitting, provides a carbohydrate load that exceeds the glycogen storage capacity of the average office worker's muscles, leading inevitably to fat spillover. Perhaps the most egregious offender in this category is the instant noodle.
This product represents the pinnacle of industrial food engineering and the nadir of nutritional value. Instant noodles are not just refined wheat, they are flash-fried in palm oil to dry them, creating a product that is simultaneously a refined carb and a damaged fat bomb. A single package often contains an entire day's worth of sodium and a glycemic load that stresses the metabolic system for hours. They are designed to be hyper-palatable, cheap, and addictive. The consumption of instant noodles has been statistically linked to an increased risk of cardiometabolic syndrome, particularly in women. They are empty calories in the truest sense, providing energy without the micronutrients, fiber, or protein required to process that energy, forcing the body to rob its own nutrient stores to metabolize the meal. The cultural programming surrounding refined carbohydrates is deep-seated and difficult to break. For decades, the low-fat nutritional guidelines of the late 20th century inadvertently promoted the consumption of these products. By demonizing dietary fat, public health authorities pushed the population toward the base of the food guide pyramid, 6 to 11 servings of grains per day. The food industry responded with a deluge of fat-free cookies, crafters, and breads that were laden with sugar and refined flour to compensate for the loss of flavor. We raised a generation on the belief that a bagel with low-fat cream cheese was a healthy breakfast while eggs were dangerous. This advice coincided perfectly with the explosion of obesity rates. We replace satiating, hormonally neutral fats with insulin-spiking carbohydrates, creating a population that is perpetually hungry, metabolically broken, and addicted to the beige diet. The elimination of excess refined carbohydrates is not a low-carb fat. It is a return to a pre-industrial physiology. It requires a rejection of the white foods, white bread, white rice, white pasta, white sugar, in favor of complex cellular carbohydrates. This means consuming intact grains like quinoa, steel-cut oats, and brown rice, or better yet, getting carbohydrates from fibrous vegetables and low-glycemic fruits. When a carbohydrate is encased in a cellular wall, fiber, it travels further down the intestine to the microbiome, feeding beneficial bacteria rather than spiking blood sugar. The transition is difficult because refined carbohydrates act on the brain's reward centers, specifically the nucleus accumbens, releasing dopamine in a way that mimics drug addiction. Withdrawal symptoms, irritability, brain fog, fatigue are real. However, breaking this addiction is mandatory. You cannot exercise your way out of a diet based on refined carbohydrates because the hormonal signal of insulin will always override the caloric burn of exercise. To heal the metabolism, one must lower the insulin load, and that begins with removing the refined fuel that keeps the fire of obesity burning.
4. The sedentary death spiral, prolonged sitting and the shutdown of lipid metabolism. The fourth habit, a sedentary lifestyle, is often misunderstood as simply a lack of exercise. This is a dangerous oversimplification. Sedentary behavior is a distinct physiological state with its own set of deleterious biological mechanisms that are separate from the benefits of physical activity. You can run 3 miles every morning and still suffer the consequences of a sedentary lifestyle if you spend the next 10 hours sitting in a chair. This is the active couch potato phenomenon. The human body was forged in the crucible of movement. For 2 million years, our ancestors were persistent hunters and gatherers, covering vast distances daily. Our physiology is designed to function under the load of gravity and the rhythmic contraction of muscles. When we sit for prolonged periods, we are not just resting. We are signaling our body to shut down vital metabolic processes. We are entering a state of dormancy that our genetics interpret as a precursor to death or famine. The primary mechanism at play here involves an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase, LPL. LPL is the vacuum cleaner of the bloodstream. It is attached to the walls of blood vessels and muscle tissue and is responsible for breaking down triglycerides, fat molecules, and pulling them into the muscle to be burned as fuel. Research has shown that LPL activity is directly linked to muscle contraction, specifically in the large postural muscles of the legs and glutes, the slow twitch fibers. When you sit, these muscles go electrically silent. Electromyography, EMG readings, show that within mere minutes of sitting, the electrical activity in the legs drops to near zero. Consequently, the production of LPL is suppressed by up to 90%. This means that the fat circulating in your bloodstream from your last meal is not being taken up by the muscles. Instead, it remains in the plasma, clogging the arteries and eventually being shunted to adipose tissue for storage. This is why prolonged sitting is an independent risk factor for heart disease and obesity, regardless of your gym attendance. You are turning off the machinery that burns fat. Furthermore, the sedentary lifestyle creates a condition of metabolic inflexibility. A healthy body can switch effortlessly between burning glucose, sugar, and burning lipids, fat, depending on availability and demand. This switching capability is governed by the mitochondria, the power plants within our cells. Mitochondria thrive on demand. When we are sedentary, mitochondrial density decreases, and the remaining mitochondria become dysfunctional. They lose the ability to oxidize fat efficiently. This means that even when the sedentary individual does move, their body struggles to access fat stores, preferring to burn glycogen and signaling for more sugar immediately after, leading to fatigue and cravings. The metabolism we often speak of slowing down is not an abstract concept. It is the literal degradation of mitochondrial function due to disuse. We must also consider the structural devastation caused by the modern chair. The chair is an anthropogenic trap. When we sit, our hip flexors, the psoas muscles, are in a shortened position, and over time they become chronically tight. Conversely, the gluteal muscles, the largest muscle group in the body and a primary engine for calorie burning, are lengthened and compressed. This leads to gluteal amnesia, where the brain effectively forgets how to activate the butt muscles even when standing or walking. Without the firing of these massive muscles, the metabolic rate plummets. Additionally, the slumped posture of the modern office worker compromises respiratory function. The diaphragm cannot descend fully, leading to shallow, apical breathing. This reduces oxygenation of the blood and keeps the nervous system in a state of low-level sympathetic stress, fight or flight, which elevates cortisol. As we have established, elevated cortisol drives visceral fat stores. Thus, the very act of sitting in a chair is a stress position that promotes obesity through both mechanical and hormonal pathways. The historical shift to a sedentary existence is the most rapid and dramatic change in human behavior in our species' history. In less than a century, we have transitioned from an economy of labor to an economy of stillness. The agricultural and industrial jobs that defined the early 20th century have been replaced by the knowledge economy, which is confined to the cubicle and the screen. We have engineered movement out of our lives. We have elevators, escalators, moving walkways, remote controls, and delivery apps. The average daily energy expenditure of a human today is drastically lower than that of a human just 50 years ago. We have created an environment where burning calories requires a conscious, often expensive,
effort going to a gym, whereas historically, burning calories was the unavoidable consequence of survival. This mismatch between our Paleolithic genome and our space-age environment is the root cause of the obesity pandemic. The psychological component of sedentary behavior creates a vicious cycle that reinforces the other bad habits on this list. Physical inactivity is strongly correlated with depression and anxiety. Movement stimulates the release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, dopamine, and endorphins, natural antidepressants. When we sit all day, we deprive our brains of these neurochemicals. To compensate for the lack of movement joy, the brain seeks chemical joy through hyperpalatable foods. Entry number 7, emotional eating. The lethargy induced by sitting makes the prospect of cooking a healthy meal seem insurmountable, leading to fast food consumption. Entry number 5. It disrupts sleep patterns. Entry number 6. because the body has not built up enough sleep pressure through physical exertion, adenosine accumulation. Thus, the chair is the anchor that holds the entire web of obesogenic habits in place. Eliminating the sedentary lifestyle does not necessarily mean training for a marathon. It means warring against the chair. It requires the reintegration of non-exercise activity thermogenesis, NEAT, into daily life. NEAT includes all the calories burned by movements that are not formal exercise: walking to the car, pacing while on the phone, fidgeting, standing, cleaning, and gardening. Studies show that the variance in NEAT between lean and obese individuals can account for hundreds of calories per day, enough to cause massive weight variance over a year. The solution is the dynamic workstation, the standing desk, the walking meeting, and the rule of interrupting sitting every 30 minutes to reactivate the LPL enzyme. We must view sitting as a dangerous dosage-dependent activity. Much like radiation, small doses are tolerable, chronic exposure is lethal. To reclaim metabolic health, we must unchain ourselves from the desk and the couch, understanding that the human body is a machine that rusts when it stops moving. We must consciously re-engineer movement back into our existence, treating gravity not as an enemy to be avoided, but as a partner in maintaining the metabolic fire that keeps obesity at bay.
5. The industrial calorie bomb, regular fast food and fried food consumption, and the era of hyperpalatability. To consume fast food and fried food regularly is to voluntarily submit one's biology to a grand, unregulated experiment in industrial chemistry. This habit, perhaps more than any other, epitomizes the disconnect between human evolution and modern sustenance. We are not designed to eat engineered food. We are designed to eat plants and animals in their natural state. Fast food is neither. It is a reconstruction of biomass, a slurry of commodity crops, corn, soy, and wheat, reconfigured through extreme heat, pressure, and chemical additives, into shapes that resemble food but function in the body like a slow-acting toxin. The obesity resulting from this habit is not merely a consequence of caloric excess, it is a consequence of cellular confusion and systemic inflammation caused by ingredients that the human body does not recognize as fuel. The cornerstone of this disaster is the deep fryer. The act of frying food, particularly in the industrial context, creates a unique metabolic catastrophe. We must look closely at the medium of frying, industrial seed oils. For the vast majority of human history, fats came from animals, tallow, lard, or fruit, olive, or coconut. These fats are relatively stable. However, the 20th century saw the rise of polyunsaturated vegetable oils, soybean, canola, corn, and cottonseed oils. These oils are extracted using harsh chemical solvents like hexane, degummed, bleached, and deodorized at high temperatures. They are chemically unstable and highly reactive to heat. When a fast food restaurant fills its fryers with these oils and heats them to 375 degrees Fahrenheit, keeping them hot for 12 to 14 hours a day, the oil undergoes oxidation. It degrades into toxic byproducts, including aldehydes and lipid peroxides. When you eat a French fry or a breaded chicken nugget, you are not just eating a potato or a piece of poultry, you are consuming a sponge soaked in these oxidized inflammatory fats. These damaged fats are incorporated into the cell membranes of every cell in your body. A healthy cell membrane is fluid and permeable, allowing nutrients in and waste out. Membranes constructed from oxidized industrial oils are rigid and dysfunctional. This cellular stiffness impairs insulin signaling. The insulin receptor, which sits on the cell membrane, cannot function properly if the membrane itself is compromised.
This is a direct mechanical cause of insulin resistance. Furthermore, the high omega-6 fatty acid content of these oils drives the production of pro-inflammatory eicosanoids. This places the body in a state of chronic, low-grade inflammation. The immune system is constantly triggered, as if fighting an infection. In this inflammatory state, the body becomes defensive, holding on to adipose tissue and resisting weight loss. The obesity associated with fried food is an inflammatory obesity, bloated, water-retentive, and metabolically stagnant. Beyond the oils, we must confront the concept of caloric density and the bliss point. Fast food is engineered by flavorists and food scientists to override the brain's stop signals. In nature, high-calorie foods like nuts or honey are rare or come with fiber that requires chewing. Fast food removes these barriers. A typical fast food meal, a double cheeseburger, large fries, and a soda, can easily exceed 1,500 calories. This is nearly the entire daily energy requirement for a sedentary adult, consumed in a single sitting of perhaps 15 minutes. The food is designed to be pre-chewed. The buns are soft and airy, the meat is ground and tenderized, the sauces provide lubrication. You can swallow massive amounts of energy with minimal jaw fatigue. This speed of consumption outpaces the release of satiety hormones like peptide YY and cholecystokinin CCK. By the time your gut signals to your brain that you are full, you have already overconsumed by hundreds of calories. The bliss point is the precise mathematical combination of salt, sugar, and fat that maximizes sensory pleasure. Fast food hits this point with weaponized precision. The bun contains sugar, often high fructose corn syrup, to caramelize when toasted and to provide a sweet counterpoint to the salty meat. The ketchup is essentially red sugar paste. The breading on the chicken is laden with monosodium glutamate or yeast extract to trigger the umami receptors. This sensory bombardment lights up the dopamine pathways in the nucleus accumbens, the same brain region activated by cocaine and nicotine. This is not a metaphor, it is neurobiology. Regular consumption of this food downregulates dopamine receptors, meaning you need more of the stimulus, more food, to get the same feeling of satisfaction. This is the definition of tolerance and addiction.
The person hooked on fast food is not weak, they are chemically dependent on a substance engineered to be addictive. We must also analyze the presence of advanced glycation end products, AGEs. AGEs are formed when proteins or fats combine with sugar in the bloodstream, but they are also formed exogenously when food is cooked at high temperatures, such as deep frying or grilling on a commercial flat top. Fast food is exceptionally high in AGEs. When consumed, these compounds bind to RAGE receptors, receptor for advanced glycation end products, in the body, triggering massive oxidative stress and inflammation. They damage the collagen in your skin, causing premature aging, and the lining of your blood vessels, endothelial dysfunction. High levels of dietary AGEs have been directly linked to increased visceral adiposity and insulin resistance. You are literally cooking your tissues from the inside out. The socio-medical impact of this habit is exacerbated by the food desert phenomenon and the economics of cheap calories. Since the agricultural shifts of the 1970s, specifically the massive subsidies for corn and soy, it has become cheaper to produce a burger and fries than a salad. We have created an economic environment where obesity is the rational choice for the poor. A calorie of spinach costs significantly more than a calorie of processed grain and oil. This economic pressure forces millions into a diet of nutrient-poor, energy-dense food. These are empty calories, not because they lack energy, but because they are devoid of the micronutrients, magnesium, zinc, potassium, vitamins, required to metabolize that energy. The body, sensing a lack of nutrients, remains hungry even after a 2,000-calorie meal. It is a paradox. The obese individual is often starving on a cellular level. This drive for nutrients causes further overeating as the body desperately searches for vitamins in a sea of starch and oil. The impact on the gut microbiome is equally devastating. Fast food is sterile and devoid of prebiotic fiber. Worse, it is laden with emulsifiers like polysorbate 80 and carboxymethylcellulose, used to improve texture and shelf life. Studies have shown that these emulsifiers act like detergents in the gut, stripping away the protective mucus layer that separates the microbiome from the gut wall. This leads to leaky gut, intestinal permeability, allowing bacterial endotoxins, LPS, to enter the bloodstream.
This endotoxemia triggers a systemic immune response that directly promotes fat storage and blocks fat burning. When you eat fast food regularly, you are cultivating a weed garden in your gut, a microbiome dominated by Firmicutes bacteria that are hyper-efficient at extracting calories from food, meaning you actually absorb more energy from your diet than a person with a healthy microbiome. To eliminate this habit is to withdraw from the industrial food matrix. It requires a return to cooking, to controlling the ingredients, to understanding that convenience is the enemy of health. It involves a detoxification period where the palate must reset, relearning the taste of real food that isn't hyper-salted or hyper-sweetened. It means recognizing that the value meal is the most expensive item you can buy, with the cost deferred to the future in the form of healthcare bills, medication, and a shortened lifespan. The elimination of fast food is the removal of a dominant inflammatory agent, allowing the body's membranes to heal, the insulin receptors to reset, and the natural satiety signals to finally be heard.
6. The metabolic nightmare, chronic sleep deprivation, and the hormonal hijacking of hunger. If fast food is the fuel of the obesity epidemic, sleep deprivation is the accelerant. The sixth habit, chronic sleep deprivation, is perhaps the most insidious because it is often celebrated in our culture as a sign of ambition and productivity. We wear our exhaustion like a badge of honor, unaware that by sacrificing sleep, we are dismantling our metabolic health at the foundation. Sleep is not merely a passive state of rest. It is an active, neurologically intense period of hormonal regulation, cellular repair, and metabolic calibration. When we chronically shorten this window, sleeping 5 or 6 hours instead of the required 7 to 9, we disrupt the delicate balance of neuroendocrine signals that control appetite, energy expenditure, and glucose regulation. The result is a body that is biologically programmed to gain weight, regardless of diet or exercise. The primary mechanism connecting sleep loss to obesity is the disruption of the hunger hormones, ghrelin and leptin. Ghrelin is produced in the stomach and signals the brain to eat. It is the go signal. Leptin is produced in the fat cells and signals the brain that energy stores are sufficient. It is the stop signal.
In a well-rested individual, these hormones function in harmony. However, research has consistently shown that even a few nights of short sleep cause ghrelin levels to spike and leptin levels to plummet. One landmark study demonstrated that sleep-deprived participants had a 28% increase in ghrelin and an 18% decrease in leptin. This creates a catastrophic hormonal environment. Your body is screaming that it is starving, high ghrelin, while simultaneously being deaf to the signal that it is full, low leptin. This is not mental hunger. It is a primal, physiological drive that willpower cannot override. The sleep-deprived brain perceives a caloric emergency and demands immediate energy. This demand is not for broccoli or grilled chicken. The sleep-deprived brain specifically craves high-calorie, carbohydrate-rich foods. This is due to the impairment of the frontal lobe, the center of executive function and decision-making. When you are tired, metabolic activity in the prefrontal cortex is dampened. This is the part of the brain that says, I shouldn't eat that donut because I have health goals. Simultaneously, the amygdala, the primitive,
emotional center of the brain becomes hyper-reactive. The reward system is sensitized. This means that the inhibitory brakes are cut and the accelerator is floored. You lose the cognitive capacity to resist temptation, while the temptation itself becomes more neurologically rewarding. This leads to the consumption of comfort foods as a mechanism to soothe the stressed brain, resulting in a caloric surplus that is notoriously difficult to avoid. The metabolic consequences extend to how the body processes the food you do eat. Sleep deprivation induces a state of temporary insulin resistance. After just 4 nights of restricted sleep, the body's ability to process glucose drops by up to 40%, a state mimicking type 2 diabetes. The fat cells become metabolically groggy. They refuse to open their doors to insulin, causing glucose to accumulate in the blood. The pancreas responds by pumping out more insulin. As we have established, high insulin locks the body in fat storage mode. This means that if 2 people eat the exact same meal, the sleep-deprived person will store more of it as visceral fat than the well-rested person. The body, perceiving the stress of sleep loss, hoards energy to ensure survival against the perceived threat. This threat response is mediated by cortisol, the master stress hormone. Sleep deprivation activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis, leading to chronically elevated cortisol levels, particularly in the evening when they should be low. Cortisol is catabolic to muscle and anabolic to fat. It breaks down precious muscle tissue to convert amino acids into glucose, gluconeogenesis, raising blood sugar even further. Simultaneously, it directs fat storage specifically to the abdominal area. This visceral fat has a higher density of cortisol receptors, making it a magnet for stress-induced weight gain. Thus, the chronic insomniac is often skinny fat, losing muscle mass in the limbs while gaining a potbelly, a body composition profile that is highly correlated with metabolic syndrome and cardiovascular disease. We must also consider the role of the glymphatic system. Discovered relatively recently, this is the brain's waste clearance system, a network of vessels that flushes out neurotoxins and metabolic byproducts like beta amyloid. This system is primarily active during deep, slow-wave sleep. When we cut sleep short, we prevent the glymphatic system from completing its cleaning cycle.
The accumulation of metabolic waste in the brain leads to neuroinflammation and oxidative stress in the hypothalamus, the control center for body weight regulation. A confused, inflamed hypothalamus loses its ability to accurately gauge the body's energy set point, often resetting it higher, leading to a defense of a higher body weight. The cultural context of this habit is deeply entrenched in the modern always-on lifestyle. The invention of the electric light bulb and subsequently the smartphone has waged a war on our circadian biology. We are exposed to blue light from screens late into the night, which suppresses the release of melatonin, the hormone that signals sleep onset. We force ourselves awake with caffeine, a stimulant that blocks adenosine receptors, masking the feeling of fatigue without resolving the underlying need for sleep. We operate on social jet lag, shifting our sleep schedules dramatically between weekdays and weekends, keeping our metabolic clocks in a state of permanent confusion. We view sleep as dead time, a commodity that can be traded for more work or more entertainment. This trade is a fraud. The debt is paid in metabolic health. The correlation between the decline in average sleep duration over the last 50 years, from roughly 8.5 hours to under 6.5 hours, tracks almost perfectly with the rise in obesity rates. It is arguably the missing link in the diet debate. You can eat the perfect diet and exercise daily, but if you are sleeping 5 hours a night, your body is fighting you chemically. Your testosterone and growth hormone, vital for fat burning and muscle repair, are suppressed. Your cortisol is high, your insulin is high, your ghrelin is high. You are swimming upstream against a hormonal current that is pulling you toward obesity. Eliminating chronic sleep deprivation requires a radical restructuring of priorities. It demands sleep hygiene, a strict protocol of darkness, coolness, and routine. It means treating the bedroom as a recovery chamber, banning screens and blue light after sundown.
It involves the disciplined cessation of caffeine in the afternoon. It requires the understanding that sleep is the foundation upon which diet and exercise rest. Without the restorative power of sleep, the body remains in a state of survival stress, holding on to every calorie, refusing to burn fat, and slowly deteriorating under the load of metabolic exhaustion. To sleep is to heal. To sleep is to slim.
To deny sleep is to choose obesity.
7. The neurochemical hijack, emotional eating, and the self-medication of the modern psyche. To understand emotional eating is to understand the fundamental architecture of human survival and how that architecture has been weaponized by modern life. This habit, the compulsion to consume food in response to feelings rather than famine, is not merely a behavioral flaw or a lack of discipline. It is a complex neurobiological event, a collision between our ancient limbic system and the high-pressure environment of the 21st century. Emotional eating represents a breakdown in the regulatory mechanisms of the self, where the act of consumption is repurposed from a method of fueling the body to a method of numbing the mind. It is a form of chemical self-medication, where sugar and fat are utilized as crude anesthetics to dull the sharp edges of anxiety, loneliness, anger, and fatigue. The obesity that results from this habit is particularly stubborn because it is rooted not in hunger, but in the desperate attempt to regulate the internal emotional landscape. The physiological engine of emotional eating is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is the body's central stress response system. When a human being encounters a stressor, whether it was a predator on the savannah 50,000 years ago or a looming deadline in a corporate office today, the hypothalamus triggers a cascade of hormones, culminating in the release of cortisol from the adrenal glands. In an acute survival situation, cortisol is a miracle. It mobilizes glucose, sharpens focus, and prepares the body for fight or flight. However, in the context of chronic low-grade modern stress, cortisol becomes a metabolic wrecking ball. One of the primary functions of elevated cortisol is to signal the brain to replenish energy stores that it assumes are being depleted by the stressful event. It does not signal a craving for salad or broccoli. It specifically upregulates the drive for comfort foods, foods high in fat and sugar. These energy-dense foods dampen the body's stress response. When you eat a donut or a bag of chips during a moment of high anxiety, you are effectively engaging in a biological transaction. You are trading long-term metabolic health for a short-term reduction in circulating stress hormones. This interaction creates a phenomenon known as hedonic hyperphagia, eating for pleasure rather than energy homeostasis. The mechanism involves the brain's reward pathways,
specifically the mesolimbic dopamine system. High sugar and high fat foods trigger the release of dopamine and endogenous opioids, endorphins, in the nucleus accumbens. This release provides a temporary sensation of relief, a fleeting moment of euphoria that counteracts the dysphoria of stress. For the emotional eater, food becomes the primary coping mechanism, the only reliable source of dopamine in a life perhaps devoid of other pleasures or overwhelmed by negativity. Over time, neuroplasticity takes over. The brain rewires itself to associate specific negative emotions with specific foods. The feeling of sadness creates a neural pathway that leads directly to the thought of ice cream. The feeling of anger triggers a subconscious demand for the crunch of fried carbohydrates. The behavior becomes automatic, bypassing the prefrontal cortex, the center of rational decision-making, entirely. The individual finds themselves eating before they have even consciously registered that they are upset. We must also examine the specific type of adipose tissue generated by stress-induced eating. Cortisol does not distribute fat evenly. Because visceral fat cells, the deep abdominal fat surrounding the organs, have a higher density of glucocorticoid receptors, cortisol directs fat storage specifically to the belly. This toxic fat is metabolically active, secreting inflammatory cytokines that further perpetuate the stress cycle. Thus, the emotional eater is trapped in a biological loop. Stress leads to cortisol, cortisol leads to cravings, cravings lead to visceral fat accumulation, and visceral fat increases systemic inflammation, which the body perceives as more stress. This is the stress-obesity connection. It explains why individuals going through divorce, job loss, or chronic depression often experience rapid central weight gain that is resistant to standard dietary interventions. As long as the underlying emotional trigger remains active, the hormonal drive to store fat remains engaged. Culturally, we are set up to fail. We are raised in a society that systematically links food with emotional regulation from infancy. When a child falls and scrapes their knee, they are given a lollipop to stop crying. When we celebrate a promotion, we feast. When we mourn a loss, we bring casseroles. We have codified the idea that food is love, that food is comfort, and that food is the appropriate response to the entire spectrum of human experience.
This conditioning is reinforced by an advertising industry that aggressively markets products as emotional solutions. Commercials do not sell the nutritional value of chocolate. They sell the moment of bliss, the escape from the chaotic day. They sell the idea that you deserve the treat. This narrative is deeply seductive to the overworked, underslept, and emotionally drained population. We live in an era of alexithymia, a condition where individuals struggle to identify and describe their own emotions. Unable to articulate that they are lonely or bored, they misinterpret these internal signals as hunger. The void is emotional, but they attempt to fill it physically. The consequences of this habit are compounded by the secrecy and shame that often accompany it. Unlike social eating, emotional eating is typically a solitary act. It happens in the car, late at night in the kitchen, or at the desk when no one is watching. This isolation fuels a cycle of guilt. The binge provides temporary relief, but as the blood sugar crashes and the dopamine fades, reality returns, accompanied by the physical discomfort of overeating and the psychological weight of failure. The shame acts as a new stressor, triggering another spike in cortisol, which drives the desire for more comfort food to numb the shame. It is a self-perpetuating spiral of destruction. The emotional eater is not just consuming calories, they are consuming their own anxiety, swallowing their feelings in a literal sense, leading to a state of metabolic paralysis. Eliminating emotional eating requires a fundamental deconstruction of one's relationship with the self. It is not a diet issue, it is a regulation issue. It demands the development of emotional granularity, the ability to precisely identify what one is feeling. It requires the cultivation of alternative soothing mechanisms that do not involve ingestion, breathwork, movement, creative expression, or simply sitting with the discomfort until it passes. We must break the Pavlovian link between the stressor and the refrigerator. We must recognize that while food can temporarily alter neurochemistry, it cannot solve the problem that caused the stress. The debt must be paid eventually. To stop emotional eating is to agree to feel the full weight of one's life without anesthesia, a terrifying but necessary step toward reclaiming metabolic sovereignty. Until the emotional root is severed, the physical branches of obesity will continue to grow.
Fed by the hidden waters of our unaddressed trauma.
The eighth habit, skipping breakfast, is a deceptive practice that masquerades as caloric restriction but functions as a metabolic trap. In the popular imagination, skipping the morning meal is often viewed as a logical way to save calories for later in the day, a mathematical subtraction that should theoretically lead to weight loss. However, human biology is not a simple calculator. It is a rhythmic, time-dependent system governed by circadian clocks. When you skip breakfast, specifically in the context of a disorganized, modern lifestyle rather than a structured intermittent fasting protocol, you are violating the body's temporal programming. You are ignoring the window of peak metabolic efficiency and pushing your caloric intake into the window of metabolic dormancy. This habit sets off a chain reaction of hormonal imbalances, blood sugar volatility, and compensatory overeating that makes obesity almost inevitable. To understand why skipping breakfast is so damaging, we must look at the concept of diet-induced thermogenesis, DIT. DIT is the energy the body expends to digest, absorb, and store nutrients. Research has consistently shown that DIT is significantly higher in the morning than in the evening. A meal of 500 calories consumed at 8 a.m. produces a larger thermic effect, burning more calories simply by being processed than the exact same meal consumed at 8 p.m. By skipping breakfast, you are bypassing the time of day when your body is most efficient at burning off the energy you feed it. Furthermore, insulin sensitivity follows a circadian rhythm. Our cells are most receptive to insulin in the morning. This means that carbohydrates consumed early in the day are efficiently shuttled into muscle glycogen stores. As the day progresses, insulin sensitivity naturally wanes. By backloading your calories to the evening, which is the inevitable result of skipping breakfast, you are consuming the bulk of your energy when your body is most insulin resistant, promoting fat storage rather than energy utilization. The primary driver of the obesity associated with skipping breakfast is the compensatory mechanism. The human body defends its energy set point aggressively. When you wake up and do not eat, your stomach remains empty, but your hormones do not remain static. Ghrelin, the hunger hormone, begins to pulse. Initially,
You may suppress this with coffee or busyness, but the biological drive accumulates. By the time afternoon or evening arrives, the brain is in a state of perceived scarcity. It does not just want food, it wants high-density energy to make up for the deficit. Studies show that breakfast skippers tend to consume significantly more calories at lunch and dinner than breakfast eaters. Moreover, the quality of food choices deteriorates. The starving brain bypasses the salad bar and directs the individual toward refined carbohydrates and fats, pizza, pasta, burgers. This leads to a phenomenon known as the sumo wrestler diet. Sumo wrestlers traditionally build their massive bulk by skipping breakfast, training on an empty stomach to maximize hunger, and then consuming a massive caloric load in the latter half of the day. Modern office workers are inadvertently replicating this weight gain protocol. We must also consider the cortisol awakening response, CAR. In a healthy individual, cortisol levels rise sharply in the 30 minutes after waking to help transition the body from sleep to wakefulness. Eating breakfast helps to blunt this cortisol spike, signaling to the body that resources are available and the hunt is over. When you skip breakfast, cortisol levels can remain elevated for longer periods. As we have established in previous entries, chronic cortisol elevation drives visceral fat storage and breaks down muscle tissue. By fasting through the morning stress, you are keeping your body in a catabolic fight or flight state, running on stress hormones rather than food energy. This eventually leads to adrenal fatigue and a crash in the afternoon, often remedied by sugary snacks, further destabilizing blood sugar. The impact of this habit extends to cognitive function and decision fatigue. The brain is a glucose-dependent organ. While it can run on ketones during prolonged starvation, the transition period of skipping breakfast often leaves the brain in a state of low energy, leading to brain fog, irritability, and poor impulse control. By the time the evening commute arrives, the breakfast skipper is mentally exhausted. Willpower is a finite resource that is depleted by low blood sugar. The exhausted prefrontal cortex loses its ability to regulate the primitive drives of the limbic system. This is why the breakfast skipper is far more likely to succumb to the temptation of takeout or convenience food on the way home.
They have no cognitive brakes left to stop the gluttony. It is crucial to distinguish the disorganized habit of skipping breakfast from the structured practice of time-restricted feeding or intermittent fasting. While TRF can have benefits, most people who skip breakfast are not doing so as part of a deliberate, nutrient-dense protocol. They are doing it out of rushing, lack of preparation, or a misguided attempt to diet. They are drinking high-calorie lattes, which break the fast with sugar but provide no satiety, or running on empty until they crash. This is chaotic fasting, and it is metabolically disastrous. The body craves predictability. When food intake is erratic, the body holds on to fat reserves as a safety measure against the unpredictability of the environment. Historical analysis reveals that the devaluation of breakfast is a relatively recent phenomenon born of the industrial and post-industrial rush. The traditional breakfast of our ancestors, often leftovers from dinner, hearty porridges, or protein-rich eggs, provided a stable fuel source for physical labor. Today, the morning rush has eliminated the time for sitting and chewing. We have replaced the meal with the on-the-go bar or the pastry, or nothing at all. We have culturally accepted the idea that the morning is for output, work, productivity, rather than input, nourishment. This is a biological error. The morning is the metabolic prime time. To eliminate this habit is to re-anchor the day. It requires a rejection of the snooze button and the chaotic morning scramble. It means prioritizing the intake of protein and fiber within an hour or two of waking. A high-protein breakfast, eggs, Greek yogurt, lean meats, stimulates the release of peptide YY, a potent satiety hormone which curbs hunger for hours. Studies consistently show that individuals who eat a high-protein breakfast experience fewer cravings late at night. They have front-loaded their satiety. By respecting the circadian rhythm and feeding the body when it is most prepared to receive fuel, we prevent the evening binge, stabilize insulin levels, and lower the stress load on the system. We must stop treating breakfast as an optional luxury and start treating it as the foundational metabolic event of the day. To skip it is to invite chaos into the system, and in the chaos, obesity thrives.
9. The velocity trap, eating too fast, and the failure of the gut-brain axis. The ninth habit, eating too fast, is a behavioral anomaly that has become the standard operating procedure for the modern human. It is a subtle, almost invisible dysfunction, yet it sits at the very heart of the obesity epidemic. We live in a culture that worships speed, fast internet, fast cars, fast transactions, and this obsession with velocity has bled into our biology, corrupting the ancient, deliberate ritual of nourishment. When we consume food at the speed of modern industry, we are not merely being efficient, we are fundamentally breaking the communication lines between the gut and the brain. We are outpacing our own physiology, ingesting calories faster than our neurohormonal hardware can register them. This creates a satiated gap, a dangerous window of time where the body is chemically full, but the mind is still voraciously hungry. In this gap, the damage is done. To understand the mechanics of this disaster, one must appreciate the complexity of the cephalic phase of digestion and the signaling lag of the human satiety system. The process of feeling full is not instantaneous. It is a slow, symphonic cascade of neural and hormonal signals that requires approximately 20 minutes to complete. When food enters the mouth, the process of mastication, chewing, stimulates the release of saliva and signals the vagus nerve to prepare the stomach. As the food travels down the esophagus and enters the stomach, the gastric walls stretch. This mechanical distension triggers mechanoreceptors that send electrical impulses up the vagus nerve to the nucleus of the solitary tract in the brainstem, signaling volume. However, volume is only half the equation. The chemical analysis of the food takes longer. As chyme, partially digested food, enters the small intestine, specialized cells in the gut lining detect nutrients, fats, proteins, and sugars. These cells then release a cocktail of satiety hormones, including cholecystokinin, peptide YY, and glucagon-like peptide 1, GLP-1. These hormones travel through the bloodstream to the hypothalamus, specifically the arcuate nucleus, to suppress the hunger neurons AGRP and activate the satiety neurons POMC. This system was designed by evolution to function in a world of unprocessed, fibrous, chewy foods. It assumes a slow rate of ingestion. When you eat a raw tuber or a piece of fibrous game meat,
you are forced to chew. The mechanical breakdown takes time, allowing the hormonal signals to keep pace with the caloric intake. Modern food, however, is engineered for speed. It is pre-digested by industrial processing. Ultra-processed foods, burgers, nuggets, shakes, white bread, are soft, lacking in structural integrity, and lubricated with fats and sauces. They require almost no chewing.
A consumer can inhale 1,000 calories of fast food in under 4 minutes. In this scenario, the caloric payload hits the stomach and intestine long before the satiety hormones have had time to accumulate in the blood. The brain is effectively blind to the massive energy surge that has just occurred. By the time the CCK and GLP-1 signals finally reach the hypothalamus, 20 minutes later, the individual has already overeaten by hundreds of calories. They feel uncomfortably stuffed, bloated, and lethargic, but the error is irreversible. The calories are already in the system, destined for the adipose tissue. The act of rapid eating also bypasses the critical psychological component of satisfaction. We call this mindless eating. In the modern era, eating has been demoted from a primary activity to a secondary activity. We eat while driving, while typing, while scrolling through social media, and while watching television. When the brain is distracted, it fails to encode the memory of the meal. Research into episodic memory and eating shows that if you do not pay attention to the sensory experience of eating, the texture, the smell, the taste, your brain effectively forgets that you have eaten. This leads to a phenomenon where the phantom hunger returns rapidly. You finish a meal while watching a show, look down at the empty plate, and feel a sense of confusion. You saw the food disappear, but you didn't experience it. This lack of sensory registration prevents the downregulation of ghrelin, the hunger hormone, leading to snacking behavior shortly after the meal. The fast eater is a ghost in their own dining experience, consuming without tasting, filling the stomach without feeding the mind. We must also scrutinize the historical shift that normalized this behavior. The industrialization of time in the late 19th and early 20th centuries created the concept of the lunch break. Prior to this, meals were often communal, extended affairs. The factory whistle and the corporate clock compressed the midday meal into a functional refueling stop.
The 15-minute lunch break forced workers to shovel food into their mouth to maximize productivity. This cultural shift coincided with the rise of convenience food, marketed specifically as a time saver. The TV dinner of the 1950s was the domestic version of this industrial efficiency. We raised generations of children to hurry up and eat so they could get to school, get to practice, or get to bed. We framed slow eating as dawdling or laziness, rather than what it is, a biological necessity for metabolic regulation. We are now living with the consequences of a society that views the time spent chewing as wasted time. The physiological consequences of rapid eating extend beyond simple caloric excess. There is a direct metabolic impact on blood sugar regulation. When you eat quickly, you dump a large volume of glucose into the bloodstream all at once. This causes a steep vertical spike in blood glucose. In response, the pancreas must release a massive surge of insulin, a first-phase insulin response that is often exaggerated. This high insulin environment, as we have detailed in previous entries, shuts down fat burning and promotes fat storage. In contrast, when you eat slowly, the glucose enters the bloodstream in a gentle curve. The insulin response is moderate and controlled. The mitochondria can handle the influx of energy efficiently. Rapid eating essentially creates a state of postprandial metabolic stress, overwhelming the system and promoting insulin resistance over time. It is a form of violence against the pancreas. Furthermore, rapid eating is often accompanied by aerophagia, the swallowing of air. This distends the stomach in a way that can be uncomfortable, leading to bloating and indigestion, which many people ironically treat with more food or medication, rather than addressing the root cause. The lack of proper mastication also places a heavy burden on the rest of the digestive tract. Saliva contains amylase, an enzyme that begins the breakdown of starches in the mouth. When you swallow food whole, you skip this initial digestive step. Large undigested particles of food enter the stomach and small intestine, where they can ferment and cause gut dysbiosis, feeding the wrong types of bacteria and contributing to the inflammation that drives obesity. Eliminating the habit of eating too fast requires a conscious, almost meditative reconstruction of the act of dining. It involves the reinstatement of the table as a sacred space.
Free from screens and distractions, it requires the physical discipline of putting the fork down between bites, a simple mechanical break that forces a pause. It means chewing food until it is liquid, reconnecting with the texture and flavor, allowing the amylase to work. It involves the 20-minute rule, ensuring that no main meal is completed in less than 20 minutes, giving the hormonal messengers time to travel from the gut to the brain. This is not just about manners, it is about metabolic survival. By slowing down, we allow the body's natural wisdom to function. We give the stop signal a chance to be heard before we crash into the wall of obesity. In a world of high-speed consumption, the most radical act of health is to simply take your time.
The 10th and final habit, the lack of weight and diet tracking, is the shroud under which all other habits hide. It is the refusal to look at the data. Obesity does not happen overnight. It is a cumulative process, a slow creeping accumulation of energy that happens in the margins of our awareness. It is the result of a slight daily error, a surplus of 50 or 100 calories, compounded over months, years, and decades. Without tracking, these errors remain invisible. The human brain is a magnificent instrument, but it is spectacularly terrible at estimating caloric intake and energy expenditure. We are evolved to survive scarcity, not to audit abundance. When we rely on intuition or memory to manage our weight in an obesogenic environment, we are navigating a minefield blindfolded. The lack of tracking allows the gradual, unnoticed weight gain, metabolic drift, to continue unchecked until it manifests as a medical crisis. To understand the necessity of tracking, one must confront the psychological phenomenon known as the ostrich effect, the cognitive avoidance of negative information. Many individuals avoid the scale and the food log because they fear what the data will reveal. They prefer the bliss of ignorance to the pain of reality. However, this ignorance is where obesity thrives. Studies on self-reported food intake are damning. When researchers compare what people say they eat versus what they actually eat, measured by doubly labeled water techniques, the discrepancy is shocking. On average, people underreport their caloric intake by 30 to 50%. We forget the handful of nuts, the tasting of the sauce while cooking, the second glass of wine, the crust of the child's sandwich. We suffer from caloric amnesia. Simultaneously, we overestimate our physical activity by a similar margin. We think the 30-minute walk burned off the cheeseburger. It did not. This energy gap, the difference between perceived intake and actual intake, is the space where fat is stored. Without an external audit, without a log, the brain will always rewrite history to favor the eater. The scale, often demonized in modern body positivity discourse as a tool of shame, is in reality a neutral biofeedback instrument. It is the dashboard of the metabolic machine.
To drive a car without a speedometer is dangerous. To operate a human body without monitoring its mass is equally reckless in an environment where food is omnipresent. The creeping obesity that affects the majority of adults is characterized by a weight gain of 1 to 2 pounds per year. This is imperceptible on a daily or weekly basis. Your clothes still fit, you look the same in the mirror, but over 10 years, this is 20 pounds. Over 20 years, it is 40 pounds. This is how a healthy 20-year-old becomes an obese 40-year-old. Regular weighing, daily or weekly, catches this drift early. It provides the error signal necessary for correction. When you see the number trend up by 3 pounds, you can make a small, painless adjustment. When you ignore the scale for 5 years and wake up 50 pounds heavier, the correction requires a monumental, painful life overhaul. The lack of diet tracking also prevents the identification of trigger foods and hidden caloric bombs. Most people have no concept of the energy density of modern food. A healthy salad at a restaurant can contain 1,200 calories due to the dressing, nuts, cheese, and dried fruit. A coffee drink can contain more sugar than a soda. Without tracking, without reading the label, weighing the portion, and logging the data, the consumer is operating on marketing, not math. They believe they are eating clean, yet they are gaining weight. This leads to frustration, the belief that my metabolism is broken, and eventually giving up. Tracking reveals the truth. It exposes the olive oil that was poured too liberally, the healthy smoothie that was a sugar bomb, the weekend binge that undid the week's deficit. It transforms eating from a mystical, emotional event into a quantifiable, manageable process. We must also address the failure of intuitive eating for the metabolically compromised. While the concept of eating according to internal cues is noble, it relies on a signaling system that is functioning correctly. As we have established in the previous 9 entries, the obese individual's signaling system is broken. Their leptin is high but ineffective, resistance. Their ghrelin is dysregulated. Their dopamine pathways are hijacked by hyperpalatable foods. Telling an obese person to eat intuitively is like telling a person with a broken compass to navigate the North Pole. Their intuition is lying to them. Their intuition is screaming for sugar and fat.
In this state of physiological corruption, data must override intuition. The external brain, the app, the log, the scale, must take over executive control until the internal biology is healed. The historical context of tracking is an evolution from the handwritten diary to the digital quantified self. In the past, tracking was tedious. Today, we carry supercomputers in our pockets that can scan barcodes, recognize food from photos, and aggregate data from smart scales and watches. The technology has removed the friction, yet the resistance remains. This resistance is cultural. We view tracking as obsessive or disordered. We pathologize the act of measuring. Yet, we measure our bank accounts, our gas tanks, our steps, and our sleep. Why is the fuel for our body the one metric we refuse to manage? The anti-diet movement, while well-intentioned in fighting stigma, has inadvertently promoted a culture of data blindness that leaves vulnerable individuals defenseless against an aggressive food industry. The food engineers are tracking every gram of sugar and every behavioral response. If the consumer does not track their own intake, they are bringing a knife to a nuclear gunfight. The Hawthorne effect is a psychological principle stating that individuals modify an aspect of their behavior in response to their awareness of being observed. When you track your food, you are observing yourself. This mere act of observation changes the behavior. You are less likely to eat the cookie if you have to pull out your phone and log it. The friction of tracking creates a mindfulness pause, a moment of second guessing where the prefrontal cortex can intervene. It turns a subconscious impulse into a conscious choice. It enforces accountability.
Eliminating the habit of flying blind is the final crucial step in reversing obesity. It requires the acceptance of objective reality. It involves stepping on the scale, not to judge one's worth, but to calibrate one's trajectory. It involves logging the food, not to be restrictive, but to be aware. It requires the understanding that you cannot manage what you do not measure. In the fight against obesity, data is the weapon of truth. It cuts through the marketing lies, the self-deception, and the fog of memory. It reveals the mathematical reality of energy balance, and in that revelation, it gives the individual the power to change. To stop tracking is to surrender control to the environment.
To start tracking is to take the controls back. The numbers do not lie, and listening to them is the only way to navigate out of the metabolic storm.